The day the bank gave him 30 days to vacate his family's 2,000-acre ranch, Samuel Croft didn't cry until the bison started digging. Chief, the massive American bison he'd raised like a son, began clawing obsessively at a patch of earth, ignoring food, sleep, even Samuel. Everyone said the old man had finally snapped. But something in Chief's eyes stopped him cold like Eleanor's eyes the day before she died. And when Samuel finally looked into that hole, what he found buried beneath the soil shattered everything he thought he knew about his land, his wife, and his legacy. Now the same bison they once mocked as a glorified pet holds the key to saving the ranch and exposing a century-old secret that Harrison Sterling, the developer circling like a vulture, would do anything to keep buried. This isn't just a fight for land. It's a resurrection. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Samuel Croft, at 72 years of age, felt the weight of the Wyoming sky pressing down on him, a burden as heavy as the decades of ranching etched into his weathered face. His land, a sprawling 2,000-acre expanse of rolling grasslands and sagebrush that his great-grandfather had settled, was more than just property. It was a living repository of his family's history, their sweat, their dreams, and their heartbreaks. But now, that legacy was slipping through his calloused fingers like fine dust. The bank had sent its final notice, a sterile white envelope, containing a death sentence for his way of life. Foreclosure was no longer a threat whispered on the wind. It was a storm cloud on the horizon, ready to burst. Compounding his troubles was Harrison Sterling, a real estate developer from Jackson Hole, with a smile as polished as his Italian leather shoes and eyes that saw the sacred peaks of the Tetons, not as a source of awe, but as a backdrop for luxury. Condominiums. Sterling had been circling for months, a vulture in a bespoke suit, making offers that felt more like insults, each one chipping away at Samuel's resolve. He wanted to turn Samuel's ancestral land into a high-end resort, complete with a golf course that would scar the very earth where Samuel's wife, Eleanor, was buried. The thought was a physical pain, a sharp stone in his gut. Eleanor had been gone for 3 years, and with her had gone the music of the ranch. The silence she left behind was vast and profound, a quiet so deep that Samuel sometimes thought he could hear the grass growing. His only constant companion, the only other living soul who seemed to understand the language of this land, was Chief. Chief was a magnificent American bison, a 2,000-pound behemoth of muscle and matted fur, with eyes that held the ancient wisdom of the plains. Samuel had found him as an orphaned calf, shivering and alone after a late spring blizzard had separated him from his mother. Against all common sense and the advice of his neighbors, Samuel had raised the calf, bottle-feeding him in the warmth of the barn. Chief had grown into the patriarch of the ranch, a silent, powerful presence who was more family than livestock. He was the last thread connecting Samuel to Eleanor, who had loved the bison with a fierce tenderness, often sitting for hours by the fence, singing old folk songs to him as he grazed. Now as the sun cast long, mournful shadows across the valley, Samuel stood by that same fence, his hand resting on the weathered wood, watching Chief. But the bison was not grazing. For the past week, Chief had been behaving strangely, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a restless, obsessive energy. He had fixated on a single, unremarkable patch of ground in the center of the main pasture, a spot no different from any other acre on the ranch. He would stand over it for hours, his massive head lowered, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the dry earth. Then he would begin to dig. It started with a few tentative scrapes of his powerful hooves, but it had escalated into a relentless excavation. Chief would paw at the ground, his hooves like shovels, sending clumps of dirt and grass flying. He would then use his massive horned head to push the loosened soil aside, his breath coming in great, steamy gusts in the cool morning air. The hole was now several feet deep and growing wider by the day. Samuel had tried to distract him, offering his favorite treats of sweet alfalfa and apples, but the bison would ignore them. His focus absolute, his mission clear only to him. "What is it, old friend?" Samuel whispered, his voice raspy with a mixture of concern and bewilderment. "What are you trying to tell me?" Chief paused his digging for a moment, turning his great head to look at Samuel. In those dark, intelligent eyes, Samuel saw not madness or distress, but a profound and unshakable purpose. It was a look that reminded Samuel of Eleanor in her final days, a look of someone who knew something the rest of the world had yet to understand. This strange behavior had not gone unnoticed. His closest neighbor, a pragmatic cattle rancher named Jebediah, had stopped by yesterday, shaking his head with a mixture of pity and condescension. "You ought to put that beast down, Sam," Jebediah had said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Samuel's worn boots. "He's gone mad. An animal that size, you can't have him being unpredictable." Samuel had just shaken his head, unable to explain the deep, instinctual trust he had in Chief. He knew the bison wasn't mad. He was communicating the only way he knew how. As if summoned by the thought of outside judgment, the sleek, black SUV belonging to Harrison Sterling crested the hill, its tires crunching on the gravel drive with an invasive sound. Sterling stepped out, his city clothes a jarring contrast to the rustic landscape. He surveyed the scene, his gaze flicking from Samuel to the digging bison, a smirk playing on his lips. "Still talking to your livestock, Croft?" Sterling asked, his voice dripping with mock amusement. "I've given you my final offer. 75 cents on the dollar for the land, and I'll even throw in the cost of disposing of that." He gestured dismissively toward Chief. Samuel's hand tightened on the fence post. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to tell Sterling to leave, but the foreclosure notice in his pocket felt like a lead weight. "He's not just livestock, Sterling. And this isn't just land. It's a failed business, Croft. A tax liability," Sterling countered, his voice losing its playful edge and hardening into cold steel. "You have 48 hours. Sign the papers, or the bank will take it anyway, and you'll walk away with nothing but the clothes on your back. Your choice." Sterling didn't wait for a reply. He got back in his SUV and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and the stench of his expensive cologne hanging in the air. Samuel felt a wave of despair wash over him. 48 hours. The number echoed in the vast silence. He looked at Chief, who had resumed his digging with renewed vigor, the thud of his hooves against the earth a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. In that moment, Samuel made a decision. The world saw a crazy old man and a mad bison. His neighbors saw failure, and Sterling saw a business opportunity. But Samuel saw his friend, his last link to his wife, his family, and his heritage, trying desperately to tell him something. He didn't know what Chief was looking for, but he knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that he had to help him find it. He would honor the bison's strange quest, even if it was the last thing he did on this land. He turned and walked toward the old barn, his steps no longer shuffling with defeat, but firm with a newfound, albeit bewildering, purpose. He was going to get a shovel. Have you ever felt a connection with an animal that seemed to defy explanation? Do you believe that sometimes the creatures we share this world with have a wisdom that we've forgotten how to hear? The decision to join Chief's mysterious excavation felt like the first real choice Samuel had made in months. The bank, the developer, even his well-meaning neighbors, had all been pushing him toward a future he didn't want. But this strange and seemingly pointless act of digging a hole in the middle of his own pasture was entirely his. He found a pair of sturdy shovels in the barn, their wooden handles worn smooth by the hands of his father and grandfather. He chose one for himself and walked back out to the pasture, the cool metal of the second shovel resting on his shoulder. Chief paused his work as Samuel approached, watching him with an air of intelligent curiosity. The bison stepped back from the hole, a clear and deliberate invitation. Samuel took a deep breath, the scent of sagebrush and dry earth filling his lungs, and plunged his shovel into the ground beside the bison's excavation. The work was hard. The soil was dense and packed, interwoven with a thick mat of prairie. Grass roots. For the first hour, Samuel worked in silence, the only sounds the scrape of his shovel and the soft snorts of the bison standing sentinel nearby. He felt a strange sense of companionship, a partnership that transcended species. They were two old souls, each weathered by time and loss, working together on a task that neither fully understood. The sun climbed higher, beating down on Samuel's back. Sweat soaked through his flannel shirt, and his muscles, unused to such strenuous labor, began to ache. He thought about Sterling's deadline, the sterile reality of the bank's letter, and the overwhelming feeling of being a man out of time. What was he doing? Digging a hole to nowhere while his world crumbled around him. He was about to give into the despair when a vehicle rumbled up his long driveway. It wasn't Sterling's luxury SUV, but a modest, dusty pickup truck with the logo of the Regional Veterinary Service on the door. Dr. Arise Thorne stepped out. She was young, barely 30, with a kind face and eyes that held a sharp intelligence. She had taken over the local practice a year ago and had attended to one of Samuel's cows that had struggled with a difficult birth. Samuel had been impressed by her quiet competence and her gentle, respectful manner. "Morning, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice warm. "I was in the area and saw you from the road. Just wanted to check in, see how things were." "And," she added, her gaze shifting to the enormous bison in the growing hole, "I admit, I was a little curious about your new landscaping project." Samuel leaned on his shovel, grateful for the excuse to rest. He wiped a sleeve across his sweaty brow. "Morning, Dr. Thorne. We're just... Well, to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what we're doing." He explained Chief's behavior over the past week, the obsessive digging, the unshakable focus. He expected her to share Jebediah's opinion, to suggest a sedative or talk about neurological disorders. Instead, she listened intently, her expression serious and thoughtful. When he finished, she didn't look at Chief with clinical detachment, but with a deep and genuine curiosity. "May I approach him?" she asked. "He's not usually fond of strangers, but he seems to know who's here to help," Samuel replied. Dr. Thorne walked slowly toward the bison, speaking to him in a low, soothing voice. She didn't carry a medical bag or any instruments. She simply approached with respect. Chief watched her, his massive head cocked to one side. He allowed her to get within a few feet, close enough for her to observe his breathing and his eyes. "Physically, he looks to be in excellent condition," she said, turning back to Samuel. "His eyes are clear. His breathing is regular. There are no obvious signs of distress or disease. This doesn't present like a typical case of aggression or cognitive dysfunction. This is purposeful behavior." Her words were a balm to Samuel's worried soul. Finally, someone saw what he saw. "That's what I'd been trying to tell everyone," he said, his voice thick with relief. "He's on a mission." "Doctor." Thorne knelt by the edge of the hole, examining the soil. "Bison have an incredible sense of smell, far more acute than ours. And they have an innate, instinctual connection to the land. They can detect changes in the soil, find water sources underground, and sense things we can't. Has there been any recent seismic activity? Any changes to the water table?" Samuel shook his head. "Nothing I'm aware of." "Then he's smelling something specific," she mused, more to herself than to Samuel. "Something that he feels is important." She stood up and looked at Samuel, a newfound respect in her eyes. "Most ranchers would have called me out here to put him down, Mr. Croft. You chose to pick up a shovel instead." The simple acknowledgement of his choice, of his faith in his animal, meant more to Samuel than she could ever know. If this story of faith and an unbreakable bond is capturing your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Your support allows us to continue sharing these incredible tales of hope and connection that prove that the deepest wisdom often comes from the most unexpected places. Thank you for being a part of our community. Inspired by Dr. Thorne's validation, Samuel felt a renewed surge of energy. He offered her the second shovel. "Care to help solve a mystery, Doctor?" A slow smile spread across her face. "I've got a feeling this is going to be a lot more interesting than my scheduled herd vaccinations. Let's see what he's so worked up about." For the next 2 hours, the old rancher and the young veterinarian worked side by side, their shovels creating a rhythm that joined the steady breathing of the bison watching over them. They spoke little, finding a comfortable companionship in the shared task. The hole grew deeper, now over 4 feet down. The soil composition began to change, the dark topsoil giving way to a denser, clay-like layer. Samuel was beginning to feel the deep ache of fatigue in his bones when his shovel struck something hard with a loud, metallic clank. The sound was jarring, unnatural. It was not the dull thud of hitting a rock. It was a sharp, resonant clang that echoed in the still air. Chief, who had been standing patiently, took a step forward, a low rumble emanating from his massive chest. He lowered his head and nudged Samuel's shoulder gently, as if to say, "There, that's it." Samuel's heart began to pound. He and Dr. Thorne exchanged a wide-eyed look. They dropped to their knees and began digging with their hands, frantically clearing the dirt away from the object. What they slowly uncovered was not a rock or an old piece of farm equipment. It was the corner of a large metal box, its surface rusted and pitted with age, but clearly man-made. It was a chest of some kind, bound with thick iron straps. As they cleared more dirt, they could see that it was old, very old, and it was sealed shut with a heavy, corroded lock. "What in the world?" Dr. Thorne whispered, her scientific composure momentarily replaced by sheer astonishment. Samuel stared at the chest, his mind racing. He thought of old legends and prospectors' tales, stories of lost gold and hidden fortunes. Could this be the answer to his financial prayers? A miracle delivered by his faithful friend. But as he looked closer, he saw that the chest wasn't a treasure chest from a pirate story. It had a more utilitarian, almost military look to it. And there were strange markings etched into a small brass plate near the lock, symbols he didn't recognize. A feeling of unease began to creep over him, displacing the initial excitement. This felt like something more important, and possibly more dangerous, than gold. He tried to pry at the lid with his shovel, but it wouldn't budge. It was sealed tight, its contents a mystery that had been sleeping beneath the prairie for who knew how long. Chief nudged him again, this time more urgently, and then looked toward the road leading off the ranch, as if he sensed that the next step was not for them to take alone. I think I need to call the sheriff," Samuel said, his voice barely a whisper. The mystery of the digging bison had suddenly become something far more serious. The call to Sheriff Brody was one of the strangest Samuel had ever made. "Brody," he said, his voice unsteady. "It's Sam Croft. You're not going to believe this, but my bison, he found something." Sheriff Brody, a man who had known Samuel his whole life and was well aware of his financial troubles, was initially skeptical. "Sam, are you all right? You haven't been out in the sun too long, have you?" But Samuel's insistence and the corroboration from Dr. Thorne, a respected professional, was enough to pique his interest. He promised to be there within the hour. The wait was tense. Samuel, Dr. Thorne, and Chief stood a silent vigil around the partially unearthed chest. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The beauty of the sunset was lost on Samuel, his mind consumed by the sealed box and its unknown contents. He felt as if he was standing on the precipice of a great discovery, that could either save him or shatter the little piece he had left. When Sheriff Brody's cruiser finally pulled up, he found a scene that defied any reasonable explanation. And telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Old rancher, a young vet, and a 2,000-pound bison, all standing guard over a hole in the ground. Brody, a stout man with a pragmatic demeanor, took in the scene with a long, slow whistle. "Well, Sam," he said, tipping his hat back, "you said I wouldn't believe it, and you were right." He knelt beside the chest, his professional curiosity overriding his initial disbelief. He examined the corroded metal, the thick iron bands, and the strange lock. "This has been down here a long time," he said, running a gloved hand over the rusted surface, "and it was buried deep. No way a person could have found this by accident." He looked over at Chief, who watched him with an unnerving intelligence. "You're telling me he dug this up?" "He's been at it for a week straight," Dr. Thorne confirmed. "We just helped him finish the job." Sheriff Brody brought a crowbar and a set of heavy-duty bolt cutters from his vehicle. The three humans gathered around the chest while the bison observed from a respectful distance. The air was thick with anticipation. With a great deal of effort, Brody managed to snap the ancient lock. The sound of the metal groaning and then breaking echoed across the quiet pasture. He took a deep breath, exchanged a look with Samuel, and then, using the crowbar, he slowly pried open the heavy lid. A musty, earthy smell, the scent of time itself, wafted out from the box. There was no glint of gold, no pile of jewels. Instead, the chest was filled with oilskin-wrapped parcels, tied with faded leather thongs. A wave of disappointment washed over Samuel, quickly replaced by intense curiosity. This was something else entirely. Carefully, Sheriff Brody lifted out the first parcel. He unwrapped the stiff, cracked oilskin to reveal what was inside: a stack of leather-bound journals, their pages filled with dense, elegant script. Alongside the journals were rolled documents, sealed with dark red wax that bore the imprint of a shell-looking crest. "What is all this?" Dr. Thorne whispered, leaning in for a closer look. Samuel took one of the journals, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was still legible. The first entry was dated 1887. He began to read aloud, his voice hushed with reverence. The journal belonged to his great-grandfather, Silas Croft, the man who had first settled this land. But it told a story far different from the simple family history Samuel had always known. It detailed not just the hardships of frontier life, but secret meetings, clandestine agreements, and a profound sense of duty. As he read on, a hidden history of the land began to unfurl. Silas Croft had not been just a simple rancher. He had been appointed as a federal custodian, tasked with safeguarding a collection of documents of immense importance. The other parcels contained those very documents. There were original land grants signed by the territorial governor. There were detailed survey maps. And most importantly, there was a treaty, a formal agreement made between the federal government and the local Shoshone tribe, a treaty that had been declared lost to history for over a century. This lost treaty granted the Shoshone people perpetual rights to the water from the river that bordered Samuel's land and designated the surrounding foothills as protected sovereign territory, the very same foothills that Harrison Sterling was planning to turn into a golf course. But the most explosive revelation was yet to come. Tucked into the back of the final journal was a sworn affidavit written by Silas and co-signed by a territorial judge. It detailed a massive land fraud scheme perpetrated by a wealthy industrialist named Alastair Sterling Harrison Sterling's great-grandfather. Alastair Sterling had used bribery, intimidation, and forged documents to illegally acquire thousands of acres of land, including parcels that rightfully belonged to the Shoshone and other small homesteaders. The evidence was all there, meticulously documented and preserved by Samuel's ancestor, who had buried the chest to protect the truth from a corrupt and powerful man. The air grew cold as the full weight of the discovery settled upon them. This chest didn't contain a fortune. It contained something far more valuable: justice. It was proof that Samuel's ranch was not just his own, but a cornerstone of a promise made and broken. It was the key to righting a century-old wrong that had dispossessed an entire people and formed the very foundation of the Sterling families. Immense wealth. As if on cue, they heard the aggressive crunch of tires on the gravel drive once more. Harrison Sterling had returned, likely to see if Samuel had come to his senses and was ready to sign away his heritage. He strode toward them, his face a mask of arrogant impatience, but his expression faltered when he saw the sheriff and the open chest. "What's all this, Croft?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "Having a little treasure hunt?" "You could say that, Mr. Sterling," Sheriff Brody said, his voice flat and official as he carefully placed the treaty back into the chest. "We've just unearthed a piece of your family's history. A piece you probably thought was buried for good." He stood up, his hand resting on the lid of the chest, his demeanor no longer that of a small-town sheriff, but of a guardian of the law. "This area is now a potential crime scene. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Sterling's face paled, his practiced confidence dissolving into a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. He looked from the chest to the sheriff, then to Samuel, and finally to the massive Bison who stood silently behind them all, a living monument to a history that refused to stay buried. What happens when a century of lies is unearthed by an animal's instinct? The discovery of the chest sent shockwaves through the small Wyoming community and beyond. Sheriff Brody, understanding the immense legal and historical significance of the documents, immediately secured the chest and its contents as evidence. He called in state historians and legal experts to begin the painstaking process of authentication. For Samuel, the following weeks were a whirlwind. His quiet, isolated life was suddenly filled with lawyers, reporters, and historians. His small ranch became the epicenter of a story that was rewriting the history of the entire region. The journals of Silas Croft, along with the official documents and the lost treaty, were verified as authentic. The evidence of the Sterling family's land fraud was irrefutable and explosive. The story of the Bison who unearthed a historical injustice became a national sensation. News crews descended on the ranch, their cameras and microphones a stark intrusion into the quiet landscape. They all wanted to see Chief, the animal who had become a symbol of nature's power to reveal hidden truths. Through it all, Chief remained serenely indifferent to the fuss, his purpose fulfilled. He returned to his quiet life of grazing, his only acknowledgement of the commotion being the occasional, gentle nuzzle he would offer Samuel. As if to reassure him, Dr. Aries Thorne became an unlikely spokesperson, eloquently explaining to the media the science behind Chief's abilities. "We often underestimate the intelligence and sensory capabilities of animals," she explained in one televised interview, with Samuel standing proudly by her side. Chief's bond with Mr. Croft and his deep connection to this specific piece of land allowed him to sense something was wrong, something that didn't belong. He wasn't digging for treasure. He was trying to heal the land, to remove a foreign object that represented a deep historical wound. The legal ramifications for Harrison Sterling and his corporation were catastrophic. His planned luxury resort was dead on arrival, as the lost treaty proved the land and its water rights were not his to develop. Lawsuits were filed on behalf of the Shoshone tribe and the descendants of other families who had been cheated by his great-grandfather. The Sterling Empire, built on a foundation of lies, began to crumble. One of the most profound outcomes of the discovery was the reconnection between the Croft Ranch and the local Shoshone people. A delegation from the tribal council, led by an elder named Benjamin Little Bear, came to visit Samuel. Benjamin, a man whose face was a roadmap of his people's long history of struggle and resilience, walked the land with Samuel, sharing stories that had been passed down through generations. He stood before Chief, not with the awe of a tourist, but with the deep respect of one who understood the bison's spiritual significance. The buffalo has always been a sacred relative to our people, Benjamin said, placing a hand on Samuel's shoulder. He is a symbol of strength, provision, and endurance. He has not only given your family back its history, but he has given our people back our truth. He has remembered what the world of men chose to forget. The meeting was not about legal strategy or financial compensation. It was about shared history and mutual respect. Samuel learned that his great-grandfather Silas had been a trusted friend to the Shoshone, a man who had risked everything to protect the evidence of the injustice done to them. It recast his understanding of his own legacy, transforming it from one of simple homesteading to one of moral courage and guardianship. Harrison Sterling, facing public ruin and a mountain of legal trouble, came to the ranch one last time. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated look. He didn't come with offers or threats, but with a single grudging question. "Why?" he asked Samuel, his voice barely audible. "My great-grandfather built an empire. Yours. He died with nothing but this land. Why would he choose to protect them over securing his own family's fortune?" Samuel looked out at the rolling hills, at the land that was now truly and securely his. He thought of his wife, Eleanor, and the songs she used to sing. He thought of Chief, the orphaned calf he had saved who had, in turn, saved him. "Because, Mr. Sterling," Samuel said, his voice quiet but firm, "some people understand that what you leave in the hearts of others is a greater legacy than what you leave in a bank." He didn't wait for Sterling to respond. He had nothing more to say to the man. His focus was now on the future, a future that was suddenly bright with possibility. The story of what he did next became a new legend for the valley. Instead of selling the land or retiring into a quiet life, Samuel, in partnership with the Shoshone Tribal Council and with guidance from Dr. Thorne, decided to honor the legacy of his ancestor and his bison. He placed the entire ranch into a conservation trust, ensuring it would never be developed and would remain a sanctuary for wildlife forever. He worked with the tribe to establish the Silas Croft and Chief Cultural Heritage Center on a portion of the land. The center would serve as a place of education, telling the true history of the valley, honoring the Shoshone culture, and celebrating the profound bond that can exist between humans and the natural world. The journals and the treaty, once buried in darkness, became the centerpiece of the museum, a testament to truth and resilience. Dr. Thorne accepted a position as the director of the sanctuary's wildlife research program, focusing on bison conservation and studying the incredible intelligence and emotional capacity of these magnificent animals. Her work, inspired by Chief, would go on to change scientific understanding of animal cognition. Years later, Samuel, now well into his 80s, but with his spirit renewed, would spend his evenings sitting on his porch, watching the sun set over the protected lands. The Heritage Center bustled with schoolchildren and visitors learning about history and respect. A herd of bison, descended from Chief, roamed freely across the plains, their presence a promise kept. Chief, now old and gray around the muzzle, would often wander up to the porch and stand with Samuel, the two of them watching the twilight in comfortable silence. The bison who had dug a hole to right a wrong had done more than just unearth a box. He had unearthed hope. He had revealed that the deepest truths are often not found in ledgers or deeds, but are written in the land itself, waiting for a kindred spirit, human or animal, with the wisdom to listen. The old man who was about to lose everything had found a purpose greater than he had ever imagined, proving that a life of integrity, in harmony with nature, was the richest fortune of all. Together, the man and the bison had shown the world that sometimes The most powerful act is not to build something new, but to honor what has always been there, and that the quietest voices, a grieving rancher, a determined bison, can be the ones that echo most profoundly through history. What do you believe is our greatest responsibility to the land and its history? How can we learn to listen more closely to the wisdom of the natural world around us? The years that followed the unearthing of the chest were ones of quiet, steady growth, like the deep-rooted prairie grass that anchored the rolling hills of the sanctuary. The Silas Croft and Chief Cultural Heritage Center became a beacon of hope and a model for restorative justice, drawing visitors from every corner of the globe. Samuel Croft, once a forgotten old man staring down the barrel of foreclosure, was now the revered custodian of a living legacy, his days filled not with worry, but with the purposeful rhythm of caring for the land and sharing its story. He moved with a lighter step, the stoop in his shoulders replaced by the straight-backed posture of a man who had found his true north. Dr. Aris Thorne, whose scientific curiosity had led her to a shovel and a mystery, had blossomed into one of the country's most respected ethologists. Her research on the sanctuary's bison herd, particularly her papers on interspecies communication and inherited environmental knowledge, had challenged long-held assumptions in the scientific community. She had turned down prestigious university positions to remain as the director of the sanctuary, finding more truth in the daily interactions of the herd than she ever could in a sterile laboratory. And Chief, the magnificent bison, the catalyst for it all, had aged into a venerable patriarch. His massive frame was a little slower, the thick mat of his fur now flecked with gray, but his eyes held the same profound ancient wisdom. He was the heart of the sanctuary, a living embodiment of its story, and he spent his days watching over his growing herd with a calm, unwavering authority. The land itself seemed to have healed alongside its inhabitants. The river, its water rights restored to the Shoshone, ran cleaner and fuller. Native grasses and wildflowers, reintroduced with the guidance of tribal elders, flourished where once there had been only overgrazed pasture. The entire ecosystem was thriving, a testament to what could happen when humanity chose to work with nature instead of against it. But the plains of Wyoming, for all their beauty, were a land of extremes. The same sun that nurtured the grass could also parch it to tinder. The same wind that carried the songs of meadowlarks could also fan a single spark into a raging inferno. The summer of the sanctuary's 5th anniversary was the driest in a century. The streams dwindled to trickles, the grass cured to a crisp, pale gold, and the air grew thick with a hazy smoke from distant fires burning in the national forests to the west. A sense of unease settled over the valley, a low-grade hum of anxiety that even the animals seemed to feel. The bison were restless, their grazing patterns disrupted, their heads often turned toward the west, sniffing the tainted wind. Samuel watched them, a familiar knot tightening in his stomach. He had seen fire seasons before, but this one felt different. There was a predatory stillness in the air, a feeling that the land was holding its breath. The call came on a blistering August afternoon. A wildfire, which had been burning in a remote section of the mountains 50 miles away, had done the unthinkable. Driven by erratic, hurricane-force winds, it had jumped 3 containment lines and was now racing across the open plains, consuming everything in its path. Its new trajectory was aimed directly at the heart of the valley, directly at the sanctuary. The evacuation order was immediate and absolute. Within an hour, the sanctuary, normally a place of serene activity, was a scene of controlled chaos. Staff members rushed to secure the precious documents in the Heritage Center, while Aris and her team tried to coordinate the evacuation of the smaller research animals. Samuel walked through it all in a daze, the roar of the approaching fire, a terrifying echo of the developers' threats from years ago. Both sought to consume his world, one with greed, the other with flame. The real problem, the 2,000-pound problem, was the bison. The herd, now numbering over 60 animals including Calves was in a state of near panic. The thick, acrid smell of smoke drove their instincts wild, and they milled about in the large pasture, their deep, guttural sounds of distress, a heartbreaking chorus. The architect of the official response arrived in a convoy of red and yellow emergency vehicles. Commander Evans of the State Forestry Division was a man forged by protocol and procedure. He was sharp, decisive, and saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities, manageable risks, and acceptable losses. He set up his command post on the hill overlooking the Heritage Center and immediately clashed with Samuel and Aris. "We need to evacuate all personnel now," Evans said, his voice sharp and brooking, no argument as he pointed to a terrifying map showing the fire's rapid advance. "The fire front will be here in less than 2 hours. We're not leaving without the Bison," Aris stated, her face smudged with soot and streaked with sweat. "They are the reason this sanctuary exists." Evans gave her a dismissive, "Look, Doctor, I have 30 people's lives to worry about. I can't divert resources for a herd of livestock. We tried to haze a herd this size last year. It's impossible when they're spooked. They'll have to take their chances. They're wild animals. Their instincts will guide them. Their instincts are telling them they're trapped." Samuel interjected, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "The highways are to the east, the river is to the south, and the fire is coming from the west. You're asking them to run into the fences of the neighboring ranches to the north. They're fenced in by our modern world, Commander. Their wild instincts have nowhere to lead them." The commander's face hardened. "That's a tragedy, Mr. Croft, but it's not my primary concern. My concern is human life. You have 1 hour to get your people out. After that, this road is closed, and anyone who stays is on their own." Aris, ever the scientist, immediately set her team to work on a desperate plan. They brought in large livestock trailers, hoping to lure the younger bison inside, but the effort was futile. The animals, overwhelmed by the sensory assault of smoke, sirens, and shouting humans, refused to go near the metal boxes. They scattered and circled, their panic making them dangerously unpredictable. The expert method, the logical scientific approach, was failing. Every passing minute felt like an eternity, the sky to the west turning from a hazy gray to a sickening, apocalyptic orange. The roar of the fire was no longer a distant threat, but a palpable presence, a monstrous beast breathing down their necks. Samuel watched the failed attempts to corral the herd, his heart sinking. He knew these animals. He knew their fear. He looked over at Chief, who stood apart from the panicked herd. The old bull was not running in circles. He stood facing the approaching fire, his massive body tense, his head raised, testing the wind. He was not panicking. He was assessing, listening to the land in a way no human could. In that moment, Samuel knew what he had to do. He walked away from the chaos of the loading pens and approached the old bison, his lifelong friend. Commander Evans saw him and shouted through a bullhorn, "Croft, get away from that animal and get in a vehicle. That's an order." But Samuel ignored him. He walked until he was standing before Chief, the heat from the approaching flames warming his face. He placed a hand on the bison's thick, shaggy mane, a gesture of trust and fellowship that had been repeated thousands of times. Over the years, "They don't understand, old friend," Samuel said, his voice soft but clear amidst the growing roar. "They see fences and roads, you see the land, you know the way. Eleanor always said you knew the secret heart of this place." Chief turned his head and looked directly into Samuel's eyes. The frantic energy of the panicked herd seemed to fade into the background. In the bison's gaze, Samuel saw not fear, but a deep, sorrowful resolve. He knew the danger, but he also knew something else. He knew the path. "Aris!" Samuel called out, his voice filled with a sudden, unwavering conviction. "Forget the trailers. Tell your team to get in the ATVs and follow me. We're trusting him. Reese looked from the failing evacuation to Samuel's resolute face, and then to the calm, powerful presence of the old bull. Her scientific mind warred with everything she had come to learn at this sanctuary. Protocol said to flee. But her heart and the evidence of her own eyes told her to trust the old man and his bison. She made a decision. "You heard him," she yelled to her stunned team. "Get in the vehicles. Follow Chief." The moment of decision hung in the fiery air, a stark choice between human protocol and animal instinct. As embers the size of fists began to fall around them, raining down from the smoke-choked sky, Commander Evans gave them one last look of utter disbelief, shaking his head at their suicidal folly before ordering his own team to pull back to the final safety zone. Samuel and Reese were on their own, their fate now resting on the wisdom of an aging bison in the face of nature's annihilating fury. Do you believe that ancient instincts can sometimes offer a wisdom that modern science protocols cannot? What would you risk to honor a bond of trust in the face of overwhelming danger? The world had been reduced to a terrifying symphony of destruction. The roar of the fire was a physical force, a constant, deafening wave of sound that vibrated deep in their chests. The air was thick with choking smoke that burned their eyes and lungs, and the sky above was no longer visible, replaced by a churning canopy of black and orange. It felt like the end of the world. But in the heart of this chaos, a strange and profound calm emanated from Chief. The old bull let out a single deep, resonant call that cut through the noise of the fire. It was not a sound of panic, but of command. The frantic milling herd fell silent, their heads turning as one toward their patriarch. He called again, then turned his massive body, not away from the fire, but parallel to its raging front. He began to move, not in a panic stampede, but with a steady, ground-eating trot. The rest of the herd, their fear momentarily subdued by the authority of their leader, fell in behind him, a river of dark fur flowing through a world of flame. "He's not running from it, he's pacing it," Reese shouted to Samuel over the engine of their rugged ATV as they scrambled to keep up. They drove alongside the thundering herd, the heat from the fire front, just 100 yards to their left, so intense it felt like it was blistering the skin on their faces. "Where is he going?" "I think I know," Samuel yelled back, his mind racing, connecting the dots of memory and history. "There's a place my great-grandfather wrote about in the journals. A place the Shoshone called the Cradle of Stone. It's a wide, barren creek bed, a natural fire break. But it's another 2 miles north." It seemed like an impossible distance, a race against a foe that devoured the very ground beneath them. They were in a corridor of terror, with a wall of fire on one side and the panicked certainty that they were running out of time on the other. Embers ignited spot fires ahead of them, and the bison herd would part around the new flames like water flowing around stones, always following the unwavering path of their leader. Samuel drove with a skill he hadn't known he still possessed, navigating the rough terrain, his eyes fixed on Chief's dark form. He could feel the presence of Eleanor beside him, hear her voice whispering encouragement, telling him to trust the animal she had loved so dearly. The Heritage Center, the barn, his home, he could see them in his rearview mirror as the firestorm swept over the ridge where they stood. He felt a pang of deep loss, but there was no time for grief. He had chosen the lives of this herd over the structures of his past, and he did not regret it. They reached the edge of the ravine just as the main fire front seemed to swell, a monstrous wave of flame cresting behind them. The ravine was wider and deeper than Samuel remembered, a great rocky scar in the earth, its bed littered with smooth stones and devoid of any grass or brush that could carry the fire. Chief didn't hesitate. He plunged down the steep embankment, his heavy body surprisingly agile. The herd followed without question, a cascade of bison pouring into the relative safety of the stone cradle. Samuel gunned the engine of the ATV, sliding down the embankment just as the last of the bison cleared the top. He, Reese, and her small team huddled in their vehicles in the center of the creek bed, surrounded by the 60-plus bison who now stood shoulder to shoulder, their bodies pressed together for comfort. And then the fire was upon them. It wasn't a wave, but a tsunami of pure energy. The roar became an all-consuming physical presence that shook the very ground. The air temperature skyrocketed, and the sky directly above them turned a brilliant, terrifying white-hot. They could hear the explosive sounds of trees bursting into flame on the rim above, and the world became a vortex of wind, smoke, ash, and heat. Reese, a woman of science and data, found herself praying. Samuel closed his eyes, his hand tightly gripping the steering wheel, and thought only of the immense, trusting calm he had seen in Chief's eyes. The bison herd stood like a single living statue, their heads bowed, enduring the cataclysm that raged just feet above them. It was the longest 10 minutes of their lives. And then, as quickly as it had arrived, the roaring began to recede, moving eastward, chasing new fuel. The terrifying white light overhead softened to orange, then to a dark, smoky red. The rain of embers ceased. The cataclysm had passed over them. A profound, ringing silence descended, broken only by the coughing of the humans and the soft, shuffling sounds of the herd. They had survived. As the first light of dawn broke through the thick pall of smoke, it revealed a scene of utter devastation. The world was black and gray, a monochromatic landscape of ash and charred skeletons of trees. The rolling green hills of the sanctuary were gone, transformed into a smoking alien moonscape. Yet, in the midst of this desolation, in the rocky cradle of stone, life remained. Samuel, Reese, and her team slowly emerged from their vehicles, their faces blackened with soot, their bodies aching, but they were alive. And all around them, the bison herd, shaken but unharmed, began to stir. Chief stood a little way off, his great head raised, looking out over the smoldering ruins of his home. He had saved them. He had led them to the one place on all 2,000 acres where they could have survived such a firestorm, a place whose location was encoded not on a map, but in the deep, instinctual memory of his species. Sometime later, they heard the sound of approaching engines. A single soot-covered emergency vehicle picked its way carefully across the blackened terrain. Commander Evans stepped out, his face a mask of disbelief and awe. He had tracked their last known position and had come expecting to lead a recovery mission, not a rescue. He walked to the edge of the ravine and looked down at the impossible scene. The entire herd, the old rancher, the veterinarian, all of them alive amidst the total destruction. He took off his helmet, his procedural certainty completely shattered. He looked at Samuel, and then at the old, graying bison. He didn't say a word. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound, humbled respect that was more eloquent than any apology. The fire had taken Samuel's home, the barn his grandfather had built, and the beautiful heritage center. It had consumed the physical structures of his life. But as he looked at Reese, at her brave team, and at the 60 living, breathing bison standing in the dawn's smoky light, he knew the fire hadn't taken a single thing that truly mattered. The heart of the sanctuary was not in its buildings. It was standing right there with him, in the cradle of stone. The days that followed the great fire were surreal, lived under a sky still hazy with smoke and tinged with the metallic scent of ash. The world had been simplified into two colors, the stark, velvet black of the burned earth and the deep, resilient brown of the bison who had walked through the furnace and emerged whole. The journey back to the heart of the sanctuary was a slow, funereal procession. Chief led the way, his steps deliberate as he navigated a landscape that was both intimately familiar and terrifyingly alien. He found paths through the devastation, avoiding smoldering logs and patches of ground that were still dangerously hot. His internal map of the land seemingly updated in real time to account for the new, broken topography. Samuel and Aris followed, the silence between them filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. They were not just returning to a place. They were bearing witness to the aftermath of a war between the land and the sky. When they finally crested the last ridge and looked down upon what had once been Samuel's home, the full weight of the loss settled upon them. The farmhouse, with its generations of memories soaked into the very wood, was a blackened foundation. The barn, where Samuel had bottle-fed Chief as a calf, was a twisted skeleton of charred beams. The beautiful Heritage Center, a place of light and history, was a pile of ash and rubble, with only its stone fireplace standing, a solitary tombstone against the gray sky. Samuel stopped the ATV, his hands falling from the steering wheel. He felt no tears, only a profound hollow emptiness. He had prepared himself for this, yet the reality was a physical blow. He slowly got out and walked toward the ruins of his home, his boots sinking into the thick layer of ash. He stopped at the spot where his front porch had been, the place where he and Eleanor had watched 1,000 sunsets. He stood there for a long time, a lonely figure in a desolate world. Chief, who had been standing with his herd, detached himself and walked slowly to Samuel's side. The massive animal came to a stop beside the old man, so close that their bodies were almost touching. He lowered his great head and nudged Samuel's arm, a gesture of profound and simple comfort. Samuel leaned his weight against the bison's immense, warm flank, burying his face in the thick, smoky fur. And there, amidst the ashes of his past, surrounded by the silence of his loss, Samuel Croft finally wept. He cried for his home, for the relics of his family now turned to dust, and for his beloved Eleanor. Chief stood perfectly still, a living anchor in a sea of grief, absorbing the old man's sorrow as he had once absorbed the heat of the fire. Aris watched from a distance, her own tears tracing clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. In that moment, she saw the entire story of the sanctuary embodied in that single image. A man and a bison, bound by a love that was stronger than fire, finding solace in each other amidst the ruins. The story of their survival, and of Chief's incredible guidance, spread faster than the fire itself. It was a modern-day legend that resonated deeply in a world hungry for hope. And then the helpers came. It started with a single pickup truck. Jebediah's rumbling up the drive, its bed loaded with bales of hay. The gruff rancher, who had once told Samuel to put Chief down, got out and stood awkwardly before Samuel, his hat in his hands. "Heard you folks might need this," Jebediah mumbled, unable to meet Samuel's eyes. "That bull of yours, he's something else, Sam, something else entirely." Soon, one truck became a convoy. Neighboring ranchers, volunteers from the nearby towns, and the entire Shoshone community descended on the sanctuary, not as tourists, but as an army of restoration. They brought food, water, heavy equipment, and a determination to help rebuild what had been lost. Commander Evans, in a quiet act of atonement, rerouted a forestry crew to help clear hazardous, fire-damaged trees, his men working alongside the very civilians he had been ready to abandon. The response from the outside world was equally overwhelming. Donations poured into the sanctuary's trust fund. School children sent hand-drawn pictures of Chief leading the other bison through the fire. A construction magnate from California, moved by the story, offered to supply building materials at cost. And one day, a certified check for a staggering amount arrived from an anonymous source in Denver, a silent admission of a debt that could never truly be repaid. The rebuilding was a slow, deliberate process, guided by a new philosophy. "We don't build it back," Benjamin Little Bear, the Shoshone elder, advised during a planning meeting. "We let the land show us how it wants to be reborn." They decided not to rebuild the old farmhouse. Instead, Samuel moved into a modest new cabin built near Arisa's research station. The new Heritage Center was designed in close consultation with the tribe, a beautiful semi-subterranean structure of stone and reclaimed wood, built into the side of a hill to be naturally fire-resistant. It was designed to honor the landscape, not dominate it. Aris took the lead on the ecological recovery. She organized teams of volunteers to reseed the scorched earth with native grasses, whose life cycle depended on the cleansing power of fire. "This isn't just destruction," she explained to a group of student volunteers, pointing to a tiny green shoot pushing its way through a crack in the blackened soil. "This is rebirth. The fire has cleared the way for a stronger, more resilient ecosystem to emerge. The land knows how to heal itself. Our job is just to listen and help it along." The ordeal had taken its toll on Chief. He was slower now, the great strength in his limbs diminished. He had saved his herd, but it had been his final, great act of leadership. He passed the mantle of herd patriarch to a younger, stronger bull, and spent his days in a special pasture near the construction site, a quiet observer of the renewal he had made possible. He would often stand for hours on the ridge overlooking the valley, his silhouette a symbol of endurance against the changing sky. Samuel spent every evening with him, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in the comfortable silence they had always shared. There was no need for words. They had faced the end together and had come through. One cool evening in the late spring, nearly 2 years after the fire, Samuel went to see Chief and found him lying peacefully in the new grass, his great body still, his journey over. There was no sadness in the passing, only a profound sense of peace. He had died in his sleep on the land he had saved under the wide Wyoming sky. They buried him on the ridge he had loved, the spot where he had stood vigil against both the developer and the fire. A Shoshone artist carved a simple, beautiful marker from a piece of river stone, etching the image of a bison and a single word, guardian. A year later, Samuel and Aris stood on that same ridge. The sanctuary was reborn. The valley below was no longer black, but a vibrant rolling carpet of green, dotted with the purple of lupine and the yellow of balsam root. The new Heritage Center blended seamlessly into the hillside, its windows reflecting the blue sky. The bison herd, larger now, grazed peacefully in the distance. The world had healed. "He would have liked this," Samuel said quietly, his hand resting on the smooth, cool stone of Chief's marker. "He would have liked the quiet." "He's still here," Aris replied, her gaze on the herd below. "He's in all of them." As if hearing her, a young bison calf born that spring detached from its mother and trotted boldly up the ridge toward them. It had Chief's markings, and most remarkably, it had his eyes, the same intelligent, curious, and ancient gaze. The calf stopped before Samuel and without hesitation nudged his outstretched hand. Samuel smiled, a deep and genuine smile that reached his eyes. The pain of his losses had softened over time, transformed into a deep, abiding gratitude. He looked at the vast healing landscape, at the thriving herd, at the brilliant young woman standing beside him, and at the calf who carried the spirit of his old friend. He understood then the true nature of a legacy. It wasn't a building that could burn or a document that could be buried. It was the love you pour into the world, the life you nurture, the wisdom you pass on. It was a sacred, unbreakable cycle of loss and renewal, of endings and new beginnings. The fire had taken nearly everything, but it had given him this perfect, peaceful moment, and a clarity that was worth more than anything he had lost. His life, and the life of his bison, had not been a story of survival, but a story of purpose. And as the young calf stood trustingly by his side, Samuel Croft knew, with a certainty as deep as the roots of the prairie grass, that the story was far from overdone. As Samuel stroked the soft fur between the young calf's nascent horns, he felt a profound sense of connection that transcended time. It was the same feeling he'd had when he first read his great-grandfather's journals. A sudden, clear understanding that the choices of one person could ripple across a century, shaping destinies yet unknown. Silas Croft had chosen to guard a truth, burying it in the earth. Now standing on that same earth, reborn from fire, Samuel understood that he had become the guardian of that truth's bloom. The wind, sweeping up from the valley floor, carried the scent of sweetgrass and damp soil, the perfume of life itself. He looked at Reese, who was watching the calf with a scientist's keen observation and a friend's gentle smile. In her, he saw the fulfillment of a promise he hadn't even known he'd made. She was the next link in the chain of guardianship. Her scientific knowledge tempered by a deep, intuitive respect for the mysteries of the land. The sanctuary, he knew, would not just survive in her care. It would flourish in ways he could no longer imagine. His gaze drifted to the valley floor, where the herd moved like a single dark river through the sea of green. He no longer saw them as individual animals, but as a single, continuous life force. A spirit that had endured because one of its own had possessed the wisdom to listen to the earth, and one old man had possessed the faith to listen to him. The pain of losing Chief had softened into a gentle, ever-present warmth. The great bull's legacy was not the stone that marked his grave, but the thundering sound of hooves on healthy soil, the sight of calves suckling from their mothers, and the quiet dignity of the herd moving as one. He was in the wind, in the grass, in the unshakable spirit of this place. Samuel thought of Eleanor, and for the first time, the memory brought no ache of absence. He could almost hear her singing, her voice not a ghostly echo, but woven into the harmony of the sanctuary, the call of the meadowlark, the rustle of aspen leaves, the deep, contented rumble of the herd. She was here. She had always been here. The buildings had burned, the papers had been saved, but the true inheritance, he now realized, was this feeling of profound peace, this knowledge that he was part of something vastly larger and more enduring than himself. He had spent his life trying to hold on to a piece of land, only to learn that his true purpose was to set it free. He had not saved a ranch. He had helped a sanctuary remember its name. The young calf nudged his hand again, pulling him from his reverie. He looked down into its dark, intelligent eyes and saw the beginning of the story, not the end. He saw a future filled with children laughing in the Heritage Center, scientists marveling at the wisdom of the herd, and a community forever bound to the land that had taught them the meaning of resilience. His life was now a story, a chapter, in the great journal of this place, and he was content. He had listened to the bison, he had honored the past, and he had helped nurture a future where the land and all its inhabitants could heal together. That, he knew with a certainty that, settled deep in his soul, was a life well lived. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.